The House Oversight Subcommittee on Corporate Subsidies and State Investments will come to order. Will the clerk please take attendance?
Chair Cara.
Here.
Representatives Green.
Present.
Beerline.
Here.
Wagella. Here. Pohetsky.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 5 members present, a quorum.
Representative Wagella moves to approve the minutes of the September 3rd meeting without objection. So ordered. To this point, we've been spending a lot of time in the Subcommittee on Corporate Subsidies and State Investments on corporate subsidies, going from the Marshall megasite to Goshen, Mundy megasite, and looking into a new process for the committee here, going into other state investments with nonprofit organizations. So this will be an opening for that conversation today. And with that, we will be hearing a presentation from the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity on nonprofit organizations. Welcome Jonathan Smith and Jayshana Hicks. If you'll please come up when you're ready. Looking forward to your testimony.
Good morning, Chair Cara and members of the committee. My name is Jayshana Hicks, and I serve as the Director of Legislative Affairs for the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, LEO as we know it. Again, joining me today is Senior Chief Deputy Director for LEO, Jonathan Smith. We appreciate the opportunity to present today. I know it was some back and forth with the office on setting a time, so I'm happy we were able to come today. And this morning, Jonathan is going to go over a quick slide deck, give an overview of the department, and then as requested, we'll dive right into our relationship with nonprofits, specifically getting into the weeds on our grant process, and of course, answer any questions that you may have. So without further ado, I'll kick it over to Jonathan.
Yeah, so thanks to the members of the committee for the opportunity to come here today and talk a little bit about the work we do to administer grants at the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. I think you all know from previous hearings, but our mission at LEO is to expand economic opportunity and prosperity for everyone in Michigan. And our vision is to make Michigan a place where all people, places, and communities have the economic means and personal freedoms to reach their full potential. Next slide is just an overview of the department. You'll see we have some major divisions, and then within those divisions, there are some individual bureaus and agencies. I won't go through all of them, but within the Office of Employment Training, several agencies and bureaus that focus on workforce development and providing services to folks looking for work and to employers who are trying to fill open positions. Within the Office of Labor, several agencies and bureaus that focus on workplace safety and enforcing state labor laws. And then within the Office of Prosperity, several offices and commissions and bureaus that focus on various aspects. But, for example, the MySTEM network, which focuses on expanding access to STEM education in K-12 system, Office of Rural Prosperity that focuses on supporting rural communities with growth initiatives. So here's just a kind of breakdown of our grants from the period 2019 to 2025. You'll see here the sort of large buckets of what type of entity these grants have gone to. 22% to other governments, usually state government or local government. Schools and universities are about 15%. Nonprofits are 40%, and for-profits are 24%. And I'll say this is a little bit misleading because one of the major sources of discretionary state grants that we administer is the Going Pro Talent Fund. Those grants go directly to businesses, small, medium-sized businesses, but they go through a local Michigan Works agency. So for our accounting purposes, that shows up as a grant to a nonprofit, but in reality, those grant dollars are going directly to businesses. So hopefully illustrative, but because of the way we track dollars in the accounting, our technology systems, there'll be some nuance here that might not come through in the large breakdowns. Just a few examples of the type of grant programs that we administer. So within the Office of Prosperity, the nonprofit relief grants, this was a legislative directed program, $35 million that we awarded to nearly 1,500 nonprofits around the state. The MyOSHA MyWish program, $400,000 this year to 99 awardees. These are dollars that go directly to employers to help them with investments in improved workplace safety. Within employment and training, the WEO Adult Dislocated Worker and Youth Grant Program. These are dollars that are directed through LEO to the 16 Michigan Works agencies to support local workforce development activity directly in those regions. By far the largest source of grants for us has been the legislative enhancement grants. This year, $309 million to 323 awardees. This is a bit estimated. We're still in the process of finalizing some grant agreements, and so, but that is up to date as of the time of this presentation. Walk you through a little bit about the grants process at LEO. 26% of grants are distributed by formula. Largely, it could be state directed or federally directed. The majority of this is federally directed, and so I mentioned previously the WEOA dollars, for example. Those are determined by federal formula, how they get distributed around the state, and so the federal dollars flow through LEO, but are really passed through to those 16 Michigan Works agencies, and so that is a formula grant with no discretion from LEO on how those are directed. About 46.5% of the grant funding is competitive RFP, and so we will put out a request for proposals. Organizations will submit responses, and then we'll walk through a little bit in the next slide on how the process is, what process is used to distribute those competitive funds. And then 27.5% of grants are issued not through a competitive process, and 97% of those are legislative enhancement grants where the budget language directs us who to give the award to. In the small handful of instances where we would direct a grant not using a competitive process, there are heightened justification and cost rationale metrics or measures that we would have to use to show why that would be necessary in that instance, but it is pretty rare. So for competitive RFPs, we will create what's called a joint evaluation committee. That joint evaluation committee will set out, they'll build a matrix for judging each of the applications that will look at the objectives of the program, the need of the organization for assistance, their proposal and how it matches their results and benefits that they have in their proposal, how that matches up with the intended program purposes. We'll look at their budget, make sure that it's reasonable and appropriate. We'll also look at their history of grant compliance, whether they have partnerships or collaboration locally that will enhance the utility of the grant. We'll look at who's staffing the grant program and what their experience is. So these are all the types of things that could go into a grant evaluation process. The individual members of that joint evaluation committee would separately score those grants, and then they'd be tabulated, and that would be the basis for making a decision around where the grants are awarded to. A little bit about our grants payment process. So by and large, payments are reimbursement based. The exception to this is when, usually the exception to this is, again, through legislative enhancement grants where the legislature's included language that direct us to provide 50% of the funds up front. That is not the standard process. Standard process is grantees submit their expenses that they have already incurred, and we would review those and then submit reimbursement after the fact. If it's not directed through legislative language, there is a process where grantees can request upfront payment, but that has to go through the state budget office and their Office of Financial Management. It's discouraged and rarely used. Our preference is to always be able to make those reimbursements after the fact rather than provide upfront cash. But again, in a handful of instances, that will happen if they request it and have good cause and it is approved through the normal process. Otherwise, would only occur because of legislative language directing it. Those processes can be those payments can be processed weekly, monthly, and the prioritization is given to organizations that have submitted complete and accurate documentation. We have 3 payment systems, which is something that we're in the midst of shifting to a single payment system, but this is a technology procurement issue primarily. But in the next slide, basically the payment process, the vast majority of payments are either through Sigma or eGrams. In the Sigma process, once the payment has been approved, it's entered into Sigma, and then before a grant is issued, one of the requirements is that the grantee has to register in Sigma and put in their financial information so that when we issue the payment through that system, it can be dispersed to them. That takes about 10 or 15 days. The eGrams payment process, slightly different. They'll submit those payments monthly, and generally will receive payment within 3 to 5 days after they've submitted. So two different systems, but hopefully moving towards a single system soon. Really important part of our grants process is compliance and monitoring. So the laws and policies that we would look to when it comes to compliance include obviously legislative language and requirements, state of Michigan policies, and then any specific language that's in the grant agreement that's executed between Leo and the grantee. During the course of the grant period, we have continuous monitoring that's happening. Usually that happens before grant funds are issued, or before all the grant funds are issued, so that if we do identify things, there's still money to be dispersed, and grantees have a lot of incentive to address it. The monitoring reviews, this is less, a slightly less, work-intensive process than a full audit. So it allows us to distribute that effort to monitor across a much larger number of grants. The internal controls in the grants team, they're working to coordinate or incorporate all of these provisions from various sources into those final grant agreements. And then for those who have so Leo manages a large number of state dollars, and so some of the grants are state or federal dollars. So for example, if we're administering federal dollars and they're passing through us, we have to also ensure compliance with those federal regulations as well. When it comes to sort of the risk-based monitoring approach, again, this is really designed to kind of maximize department resources across the largest possible number of grants. Some of the criteria that our grants compliance team is going to be looking at the outset before we even enter into a grant agreement with an entity is going to be, how long has this entity existed? How large are they? How large is the award relative to their budget? What is their history of managing state or federal grant programs in the past? Essentially, how much do we know about this organization? What's their track record of managing public dollars? And so for organizations that are well-established, long history, have received large grants from us year in, year out as part of their operating budget, we have strong relationships and understand their compliance processes. And so there's less there to give any red flags. But for an organization that might be a newer organization or one that doesn't have a history of managing state or federal funding, we'd put some heightened scrutiny on monitoring those organizations, just given that their experience is less robust. Generally, that monitoring is a desk review, meaning we'll look at payments, we'll look at documents, we'll look at what they're reporting in their updates to us that are required as part of their progress report. If there's a need to, we can do on-site reviews as well. So the steps in the monitoring process, it starts, these are sort of formal steps that we'll participate in with the grantee. We'll start by analyzing prior audits, policies, and documentations as a pre-review. We'll have what's called an entrance conference where folks from LEO and folks from the organization will sit down together, outline the scope of the review with the grantee. We will start collecting documentation, conducting interviews, and tracking all those findings, and then we'll have what's called an exit conference. And so at that conference, we'll share the draft findings and recommendations, give the grantee an opportunity to review those and resolve any disputed issues or make any edits that might be needed to the final draft. When we report an issue, there's two outcomes. One is what's called findings. The other one is recommendations. Findings, is where there's a non-compliance issue that's been identified, and that may result in disallowed cost. A recommendation is advice to the organization around, best practices to follow in the future to ensure improved compliance. That final report will be issued within 45 days of that exit conference. Grantees then have a chance to respond, and then we'll issue the resolution letter sort of laying out what steps have been taken. So that is the grants process that we use in the compliance process, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you for your testimony today. I have a quick question before we start to turn it over to others for questions. My first one would be in terms of the grant recipient process. How long is the application? And can you tell me a little bit more about the interview that you would do and how many pages the application process would be?
Well, it would vary depending on the type of grant that's issued. So for a formula grant, obviously we're directed. For a legislative enhancement grant where there's not a competitive process, there is no process for deciding between organizations. So for those competitive processes, that would be if there is policy or boilerplate or state law or federal law that creates a process, that's what we would follow. Otherwise, the process can vary. Usually, there is an RFP that is issued. Applicants have a chance to respond to the RFP. Usually we'll have a webinar or some sort of portal where organizations can ask questions, and then we'll provide answers to public in a public way so that everyone who might apply can see the answers to those questions. Once we've received the application, we're not engaging in back and forth discussion with the applicants. We're just reviewing purely what's on the paper. And then after we've made a grant decision, the next step is a grant agreement then has to be entered into. And so that is where our grants team will have discussions with the grantee around the terms of that grant agreement. There's a standard state grant agreement, and generally, if the grantee is happy with the standard agreement, that process can be pretty quick. The more changes to the standard agreement the grantee requests, the longer it can take because they need to be reviewed and negotiated. So there's no single standard timeline.
But do you have a ballpark, though, in terms of the length of application from the shortest to the longest?
The application period is usually 30 days or something like that.
The paperwork, like is it 4 pages of paperwork, 100 pages of paperwork? How many pages?
The grant agreement, so you're not talking about necessarily the application process, you're talking about the grant agreement process of entering into the sort of formal agreement between Leo and the grantee. Yeah. It can happen very quickly, like days, weeks. Again, standard grant agreement, I think, is 4 or 5 pages. It's not a very long agreement. There's paper that needs to go back and forth, but it can be a very quick process. If it extends, it often can be due to circumstances outside of the agency's control. So, for example, with the legislative enhancement grants, as you all know, there's a form that legislators have to fill out and submit, approving attesting to the public purpose of the grant. Sometimes those are returned very quickly. Sometimes they're not, so that can delay the process. If they request upfront cash payment as part of their application, and it's not directed by legislation, that can take months to negotiate.
Yeah, but not so much the time. I'm curious in terms of the volume of paperwork for the application. For grants for roads, it's a lot of pages, 100 pages for a grant application for trying to get state funding. I'm just curious, how much paperwork are recipients doing filling out application forms? I understand it's different based on, the dynamics at hand, whether federal government's involved or not, but what's the typical amount of paperwork from the low end to the high end?
Typical amount of paperwork for a discretionary grant issued with state funds where there's no state or federal requirements that are being layered in, it's pretty light touch. I mean, it can be 10 questions, we want to understand, obviously, enough about the organization to have confidence that they will be good stewards of public dollars. Okay. But we try to make it light touch. Where things can get complicated is when there are either state or federal requirements that get layered into a grant program. And so that often can lead to a more lengthy application process. But, when we're issuing grants with state dollars that don't have additional requirements on top of them, we try to make it pretty easy to apply.
Good, thank you. Question from Vice Chair Green.
Hi, thank you so much. Going into your LEO grants examples, I see that you have nearly 1,500 awardees for the nonprofit relief grants. Can you dive a little bit deeper into that? Like, is there a specific geographic or demographic priorities in place when selecting the nonprofits, such as like focusing on underserved communities? Like, how do you determine the awardees of those specific grants?
Yeah, that was a one-time program funded with some of the federal American Rescue Plan dollars that were distributed to the state. The purpose of that program was, as you may recall, during the COVID pandemic, many nonprofits who had issues with their private fundraising and were financially distressed. The Michigan Nonprofit Association, I believe, was the primary entity that advocated with the legislature for the creation of that program. The dollars were given to LEO to distribute, but it was the Nonprofit Association that helped develop the distribution criteria and helped run the process of evaluating grant applications on the state's behalf. It was largely, if I recall correctly, the purpose of that program was largely to provide financial relief to organizations that had a demonstrated reduction in operating budget due to the pandemic. And so that was the goal. But I'd be happy to, if you have more specific questions, we can go back and get you more information about that program.
No, and that just addressed the prosperity one. Then the other ones, did they have nonprofits in them as well? The MyOSHA, My Wish, and the E&T grants?
Sure. So the MyOSHA dollars my understanding is that those go directly to businesses that apply for the funds. They have projects that they would like to complete that would enhance workplace safety. So maybe they want to put in a new air filter or, some piece of equipment that would help them make a safer workplace for their employees. And so those are small grants directly to employers for those projects. The WIOA funds, these are federal workforce dollars. They go directly to the 16 Michigan Works agencies, which are set up as nonprofits. A lot of those funds then will go to support, training workers and matching with employers. But those are all, the direct recipient is one of the 16 nonprofit Michigan Works agencies. But then from there, the dollars flow directly to individuals. They might flow to training providers, community colleges. In some cases, they might go to employers to help with, hiring new employees. But from our accounting perspective, it would all be counted as nonprofit dollars.
Okay. Do you ever do an audit or measure the impact of the dollars going out?
Oftentimes, yes. So, for example, we're required for the federal WIOA dollars to track outcomes and report those outcomes to the Department of Labor as part of the statutory, framework that governs the workforce system. And so those dollars, we do track progress and report that. For other grant programs, I would say it is something we would endeavor to do in every instance. the legislative enhancement grants, for example, that's the largest source of grants that we administer. Very difficult because they all are for different purposes, and the purposes are largely driven by legislation. So it'd be hard for us to measure progress against all of them. We're certainly looking at each one and looking at the spending to make sure that it is spent in accordance with the plan that they've entered into as part of the grant agreement. But for like larger programs, if it is a large grant program that we do every year, then we would, generally speaking, absolutely have performance tracking. For example, Going Pro, those are state grants. There is a process every year. We sit down with employers, we sit down with the employer representatives, such as the Michigan Manufacturers Association and others, and we sort of walk through where the dollars were spent. We track the increase in pay that went to the employee, the increase in retention. So there's data that we're able to track, and then we have a feedback process directly with the folks who have a vested interest in that program being successful. Smaller programs, we just may not have the resource to have that kind of process in place, but where it's a large program that occurs regularly, we would absolutely have a process like that.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
If there is an issue with one of the grants that have been given out, is there a clawback provision if they're not meeting the metrics?
Yes, there is. And so our team will review so assuming this is being done on reimbursement, it's not one of the cash upfront ones, we'd be reviewing it obviously in advance, before sending payment. But if it was one of the legislative enhancement grants where we were required to provide 50% cash up front, if we would still review the monthly reports that we're getting in terms of, they still have to tell us what they've spent the dollars on. And so our team would be looking at that, and if they identify things that are not in compliance, they would enter into a process to claw those back. And so this year, for example, I think there was about $100,000 worth of expenses that were incurred by an entity. They submitted those expenses. They were for expenses that occurred prior to the grant agreement being entered into, so not covered by the grant agreement. And we successfully clawed back, I think it was $99,000 or $100,000 from that entity.
Is that the only example, or are there any other clawbacks?
That's an example I have from this year. I would have to go back and talk to the team to see how often that happens, or how, I would say it's, obviously our hope is that it would happen pretty rarely, and because most of the grants are done on a reimbursement basis where there's no cash up front, it's not a tool that we would need to use very often, but we do have it available, and we do use it when we identify those expenses.
Good. And what is the total number of grant recipients administered through LEO?
I can tell you that I think the number there's a little bit of a disconnect between the accounting system and how it tracks those grants in terms of, they can cover over multiple fiscal years in some cases, or they might be awarded in one fiscal year, but not because if the grant is entered into late, then it would extend into the next fiscal year. But I believe the figure we have from 2019 is that it was about 3,000 grants between fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 25.
Okay.
And 2,000 of those, I believe, about 2,000 were legislative enhancement grants.
Okay, yep, good to know. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Looks like we have a question from Minority Vice Chair Wagella.
I don't know if you could go back to slide 4 of the pie graph. I was just curious if the percentages are based on pure number of grants, or it was based on the value of grants, like in terms of cash value, or is it just number?
I believe that's the dollar value. It's
okay.
Yeah.
I just thought that was interesting, especially that private's bigger than governmental or state and local. But that being said,
oh, sorry, but yeah, it's organization, but is that
It's the number of organizations.
the number of organizations?
Yes.
Okay.
I would be interested at some point in seeing the cash value amount, then how that's distributed relative to the amount of grants. But I do have a question about the legislative enhancement grants. Okay, so lawmaker secures legislative enhancement grant. What percentage of those would you say have the 50% upfront clause? Is that rare or more common to be structured that way?
There were, I think, a couple of fiscal year budgets that extended that provision to most, if not all, of the legislative enhancement grants that came to Leo to administer. I believe that was FY23 or FY24.
Yeah, I can speak to it a little bit more. So it is a fairly new process, and even though in boilerplate it provides the option for an advance, it's still optional, and so and they would still have to be approved by SBO. So if an organization now, although the boilerplate language allows for that, they do request it. They do have to seek approval through SBO, their financial management office, which is a lengthy process. So most grantees end up opting for the reimbursement method, so it's not used very often.
Okay, so if I can just get a little leeway, just because I'm trying to understand. So let's say I have a nonprofit, I get a grant. I enter into an agreement with Leo. I might get my 50% up front, or I might not. And then I have to, for the rest of that money to come through, I'm submitting the receipts for the projects. Is there any point where Leo then goes and verifies said expenses, or is it just looking at the receipts and confirming?
You mean like, are they
Like
doing
photos submitted? Does Leo go out to the site? I just am curious, like, at what level of verification is there to receive the final 50%?
Generally speaking, they would be reviewing the expense reports submitted. They would be looking to ensure that the expenses that are claimed are appropriate for what is in statute, the boilerplate, the grant agreement language. I think it would be pretty rare for us to do a site visit. The vast majority of cases, a lot of the expenses are staff time dedicated to administering a grant, right? They're providing services to the community. So for example, it's a nonprofit organization. Our grant dollars are funding, staff that is going out into the community and supporting whatever the mission of that nonprofit is, for example. And so if there are goods or equipment or anything that are purchased, they would have to be included as part of the allowable cost in the grant agreement. And then we'd be looking to see, is the claimed expense match up with the type of expense that was approved in the grant agreement as appropriate.
Do they have to physically submit the receipts, or are they just writing, hey, I spent it on this is what I'm claiming?
If they are spending dollars, they're showing the receipts on where it's spent. If it's in kind, or if they're, but yeah.
Okay, thank you.
What is the total dollar amount in grants for the last fiscal year?
So do we have it for just FY25?
Are you referring to just the enhancement grants or just
All grants.
We'll have to follow up with you.
Okay. I do have that similar question about broken down by each category would be good. Probably for a year. I mean, if you do 2019 to 2025, that's great, but definitely this past fiscal year would be great to get that broken down. And not just from the percentage for the numbers of organizations, but how much, dollar amount as well as just that top dollar amount of overall grant recipient expenditures for the past fiscal year.
Okay.
And what criteria goes into determining a grant recipient? Does it have to be a 501c3? Can it be a C4, C19s? Who's eligible?
It would be that would be dependent upon if there are specific criteria written into the grant program.
Can it ever be a C4?
I would have to go back and ask I can't think of times I can't think of any large grant programs we have where a C4 would have been an applicant or a recipient. I would have to go back and double check to see if there's any specific law that would bar it, but I'd be hard pressed to imagine a time when a C4 would be able to apply for a competitive grant under one of our grant programs and be awarded funding.
And then is one of the metrics that you look into when awarding a grant to a 501c3 ensuring that they don't have a sister 501c4 organization?
I would have to go back and look. I don't know that we would be looking at the organizational structure to see if there were separate organized entities that were related. I
Affiliated
think we'd be
with
only
them.
looking at the app.
Is that something you think that would be wise to do moving forward?
I would say that that is a policy question that the legislature and, folks, we implement the law, right? And so if there were.
We could decide that, but with your discretion that you make at Leo, you could also see, is it wise to give money to a 501c3 that has a sister affiliated entity that's a 501c4?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speculate on a hypothetical. I can't, from what I know about the grant programs that we administer, by and large, we're administering programs for direct service in a community. They're related to workforce development. They're, I can't think of a grant program that we would administer where a C4 would be a credible applicant, where they would be wanting, where they would have an application for those types of funding. So
C4 wouldn't apply though. Their sister C3 entity might.
Yeah, well, I mean, in that, again, I would have to go back and look and see
Sure.
what's required. I mean, I can't imagine every scenario where there might be a C3 that's doing valuable community-based work where it's segregated from some other organization that does different work. It's.
But in your current vetting process, Leo is not ensuring that a C3 isn't closely tied to a C4.
I will have to go back to you with an answer on that. My understanding is that we will look at the grantee organization. I don't know that we would look at affiliated organizations that were organized separately under different parts of the law.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
Okay. Next question from Representative Beerline.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to stay on this slide for a second. So the 309 million in enhancement grants, it says that they're not all completed. So is that number the fully legislated awarded amount, and it just hasn't, those projects haven't been completed, or will that 309 million grow as projects complete?
I believe it will grow, but by a very small amount. I think there's only like two enhancement left that have not been completed.
Claimed.
Yeah, well, we're still in negotiation on the grant agreement.
Okay. And then the Michigan Works grants, do you know, I mean, I know they use a lot of that for training, prepping people for work. Do we know how many folks have received some sort of training as a result of that $79 million?
Yes, we track, the Michigan Works agencies and Leo's Workforce Development are required to track the dollars attached to an individual. And so when we report out, we have to report outcomes to the federal government on the number of individuals served.
Is that a number that you could get to us? I don't.
I can
expect you to have
absolutely get
off
it
the
to you. I
top
don't
of
have it
your
off the top of my
Yeah.
head, but yeah, we can absolutely get you that number.
Okay, thank you.
Is compensation or salary for grant recipients something that's looked into?
We would look at the amount of dollars that are grant dollars that are going to salary costs to see if it's appropriate. We wouldn't have I don't believe that we would look at salaries that were not connected to the grant, where there are no state dollars going to support that. So for example, if there was an entity that applied for a grant and part of what that grant was going to do was pay for staff time associated with administration of the program, we would look at the amount of money claimed versus the number of hours, that pledged to work and see, is this an appropriate amount of state dollars to go towards the staff time that we're buying with our state dollars, right? We wouldn't, I don't believe, have a reason to look at salaries for individuals who are not, seeking reimbursement with grant funds for their time and expenses on that grant, right?
So if they're seeking a grant for something other than salary assistance, would you look at the salaries of the
we would look at whether
nonprofit,
the
for
public
example?
dollars were being used in accordance with state law and state budget office procedures. We'd be looking to see that the expense of the staff that were being reimbursed with state dollars, that was an appropriate amount of spending. We wouldn't look at the salary of unaffiliated staff members to see if they were, overpaying for something, right? I mean, it's just not, that wouldn't be a part of our, we wouldn't have a legal reason to do that, right? We were given state dollars and we're tasked with making sure those dollars are used appropriately. So we would look at how those dollars are being spent for staff time. We wouldn't look at compensation outside of that.
But making grant decisions for who's going to be the recipient, even if it's not for covering the salary of the people at the top. If they're getting $200,000 or more, seems like that might be a red flag that is that an appropriate nonprofit, for example, to be awarding taxpayer funding to. I know we in the legislature are the ones who say go and do it, but you have to decide who to give it to, and seems like that might be a metric to look at as well.
I mean, I guess what I would say is that we have an obligation to, we are given an obligation and we are given authority by the legislature to implement programming. And in a grant program, the authority that you have given us is to ensure that those state dollars are spent for a particular purpose. It would be, I can imagine if we started if we were to expand beyond our authority and start looking at all manner of different questions that had nothing to do with the administration of those grant dollars, I don't imagine, I mean, you could be calling me in here for a whole different reason, right? And so we administer the law. The law says, make sure that these grant dollars are spent appropriately for this purpose, and we will do that. But we don't have a broader agenda that we can pursue just because we administer state grant dollars.
So we in the legislature might want to be mindful when we make our decisions about setting you guys up for success, about if nonprofit organizations are to be getting money, how much can the top person be getting at the nonprofit if they're going to be getting taxpayer assistance for something unrelated than the grant being for their salary. That could be some type of dynamics we could put into our considerations, but that's up to us to decide, I suppose. Next question from Minority Vice Chair Wagella.
Hi. So I just had a couple questions. One, generally, like the timelines of the agreements. I'm assuming they're time bound. What is the usual time bound of like let's say the project doesn't get finished by this date, then what happens in that case?
Yeah, it would be laid out in the grant agreement, and so they would have. Oftentimes they'll have multiple years to spend down the dollars. I don't know if there's a standard term, but it would depend on a lot of the grants, right? These are for one fiscal year, right? So I would say the vast majority of our grants, like for example, that go to the Michigan Works agencies, they're receiving grants to help cover the operational costs that they incur to do services on behalf of the state over the course of that fiscal year.
And then the agreements themselves, are they available in a central location for the public to view, or is it something you'd have to FOIA? I just was curious about like the level of transparency we have to the public on them.
I think for a variety of reasons, we would not necessarily make every grant agreement publicly facing for various reasons, but anything that's submitted, anytime an entity applies for state funds and receives those state funds, FOIA rules would apply. And so if there is interest in any of those, grant agreements or any of the, anything associated with it, it is publicly available, but not something that I think we proactively, put out in a public-facing way.
Okay, I was just curious. I'll probably reach out. I'm just curious to see what they look like. So maybe I'll.
Sure. Yeah, and we can give you like standard grant templates that we use to negotiate, and all. There's a lot of material we could provide if that's of interest.
Thank you.
Are you familiar with the Michigan Impact Grant Program?
I likely am, but I might need to refresh myself.
So there's 10 organizations who got $15 million for the Michigan Impact Grant Program. One of which, according to Michigan.gov, looking on the website here, was the Lakeshore Legal Aid. And it says that Lakeshore Legal Aid offers legal services for low-income families of color and will use their $1.57 million grant to expand their capacity. Do you think that it's appropriate to use the color of somebody's skin in determining whether or not they're eligible for a grant?
Anyone who receives state grant dollars has to comply with state law in administering those state grant dollars. And so if they have activities they pursue with private funds, they can do so. Any organization that receives state funds would have to, administer those dollars, spend those dollars in accordance with state law, including the state constitution, which, as you know.
So The argument is that is equal protection to say that if we have a program, for example, that's for low-income individuals, regardless of color of skin, to me that would be appropriate if it makes sense to have that type of program and to look for a grant recipient to execute that type of program. But to have a qualifier that the color of their skin determines whether or not they're going to get any of these services, how's that appropriate?
So the organization, in order to receive the funding, would have to be spending those dollars in accordance with state law. And state law would not allow for...
So state law allows for this segregation of funds. Taxpayers have to fund for certain color people to get a certain benefit that other people aren't eligible to receive?
Organizations can have a mission and they can pursue that mission with private funds. Organizations who pursue state funds have to spend those funds in accordance with state law. And so they can continue to use their private funding for programming that might not be in compliance with state law purposes, but the specific state dollars they spend, the programs they maintain with those state dollars would have to comply with state law, including state non-discrimination laws.
But this seems to be their mission, is to focus on low-income families of color, and Leo chose to reward them as a recipient.
I mean, I'm happy
With
to
public
go back
taxpayer
and look
funding.
at I don't have enough specific information about this instance, but what I can imagine being the case in this instance is that they might have a mission that says, we have a community that has disproportionately lacked access to these services, and so that is in general our mission. My suspicion is that they likely do not turn folks away or discriminate against them if they seek those services, and they certainly would not be allowed to do that when it comes to the administration of state dollars for those services. But it's not uncommon to have organizations have a private purpose, but also have, for example, there are many religiously affiliated nonprofit organizations that have charitable arms, and those religiously affiliated organizations have freedom under the Constitution to pursue policies they want to pursue that are driven by their religious purpose. But when it comes to the administration of any public dollars, they have to do so in ways that are compliant with state or federal law.
The program description at Michigan.gov for another one is, this is the, it's called Alternatives for Girls. The nonprofit for this program description, which seems to be the grant that they're receiving through Leo, the nonprofit will use the $1.57 million grant to expand their services to more young women across the county. This is for high-risk young women of color in Wayne County, guaranteeing income of $1,000 per month for 18 months. So the program description, this isn't just their vision, but this is the program description for them receiving this $1.57 million.
What I can tell you is that they would have to spend those dollars in accordance with state law. And so in many instances, there may be reasons why certain dollars may be intended to be targeted towards a particular audience. So for example, in the employment section, there are many industries where employers are telling us, we really need help. All our employees are older white guys, and we need to be able to reach some different audiences, because if we're going to be able to meet our hiring needs, we can't just keep hiring the people who show up in the door. We need to go actively recruit folks who are not the type of people who normally show up and apply for these jobs. This is filling a critical need for us. And so, in that instance, we'd be certainly trying to target dollars to help that employer reach an audience of potential employees that they're telling us are critically needed in order to meet their goal of having, a workforce that is meeting their needs, right? So it's hard for me to answer, like in every hypothetical, whether these dollars is a good idea or a bad idea. What I can tell you is that there are many instances where, it would be for a legitimate reason for someone to say, we're going to have, our intention is going to be to focus in this area because it's meeting a critical need for the grant recipient or the grant program. But even in those instances, state law would apply, and dollars certainly wouldn't be able to be spent in a way that's discriminatory.
I would think that it should not be discriminatory. I'd agree with that. State law applies, and so does the Constitution. We're supposed to have equal protection, not picking winners and losers based on color of skin. That, to me, is a basic concept of equal opportunity in America. Next question from Representative Beerline.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To what extent do you have discretion when you're awarding grants?
It would depend on the program. If we've been given so for example, there are programs where the dollars are competitively awarded. There are state or federal requirements around how that competition needs to, like what the scope of that competition but like the intended recipients are defined in some way. And so we can have a competition within a pool of statutorily defined potential grantees, but it can't go beyond that. There are times when we have no discretion, where the legislature said you have to award these dollars to this person. If there are no sort of statutory or boilerplate restrictions, we have more discretion. But again, it would depend on if the dollars were given to us with particular purpose, in which case the dollars are going to be looking primarily at, is the organization who is applying for these dollars going to do the thing that is consistent with what the program is for, not necessarily what type of recipient it is.
So if you have a competitive grant program that, maybe you're going to be award 10 and you get 20 applicants, is it public how the scoring system will be? What is the criteria that you use then?
Yeah.
To determine who will receive those awards?
So anytime we do a public competition for state dollars, we will put the grant application publicly on our website or through our grant portal. It would include the scoring matrix, like how these will be evaluated and the type of points that are attributed to them. And then we'll also have a webinar. We'll put up Q&A documents. And so we want organizations to have we want it to be as clear as possible. Like the hardest thing for us when we're doing these is when we have a bunch of applications where it's clear they didn't really understand what we were looking for, and now we've got to figure out how to make awards when we've got applications that don't match up. We have a strong incentive to try to give everybody as much information as possible to give us a very high quality application. That makes our job a lot easier on the evaluation side.
Do you know how much money was awarded to art and cultural grants last year?
I wouldn't have that off the top of my head. I don't know that we. Oh yeah, is that an MEDC? Sorry, is that an MEDC? Are you talking about a specific grant program that MEDC?
Either inside of MEDC or outside. MEDC is within LEO, so whether it's through MEDC or any other entity under LEO that would be administering.
If the Arts and Cultural Grant Program is a program that MEDC administers, I would not have information about that program. If you're asking about...
Who does MEDC report to?
MEDC's CEO reports to an executive committee.
Under LEO?
No, the executive committee is established by statute as an independent reporting entity. So state departments have a cabinet level official who's an unclassified state employee that reports to the governor. What are called type 1 agencies or other agencies that are established by statute to have an independent reporting structure and governance structure
So the MSF and the MEDC, they operate and they get their funding through LEO, but they don't report to LEO. Is that correct?
Their funding is in the LEO budget, but their funding goes directly to MEDC and is administered by MEDC under the statutes that created MEDC and govern how MEDC operates within state government.
Okay, so there's no working relationship other than the money comes through LEO, appropriated basically.
I mean, there is no...
So are there any art and cultural grants outside of MEDC, or is it all under MEDC?
So I'm not familiar with every MEDC grant program. If there's a grant program called the Arts and Cultural Grant Program that's administered by MEDC, then it would be entirely administered by MEDC.
But you guys don't do anything through LEO for art and cultural projects?
Was there was a grant for museums, right? So
So you do some.
yeah, so of the many grant programs we've been asked to administer over the years, some have had intended recipients that were arts and cultural organizations. The most recent one I can think of was the museum grants, which again was a program created by the legislature and given to Leo to administer.
It's one-time funding for $9 million.
Right. So of the legislative enhancement grants, I'm sure many of them might have had an arts and cultural purpose. It's the primary, our primary programming that we administer is workforce, workplace safety. It's, the kind of core Leo functions. We do occasionally have other types of grant programs we're asked to administer. The museum one is the only one I can recall recently that has a specifically arts and cultural purpose.
Okay. And it looks like we have another question from Minority Vice Chair Wagella.
Sorry, maybe less of a question. I just think important for us to get things accurately. First off, Chair, I would argue that the United States has had a vast history of discriminating based on race, but that can be a discussion for another time.
I'll take latitude to come back on that one right here. We have corrected that mistake in the past, and I think we can all agree that liberating equal justice and not having slavery is a wonderful thing. So just because we made a mistake in the past doesn't mean that we shouldn't get it right moving forward. Martin Luther King Jr. had a very powerful vision that one day we would all be treated equally based on the content of our character, not the color of our skin. We shouldn't reverse course just because we made a mistake in our nation's past. We should do better.
In regard to Lakeshore Legal Aid, though, I will say I've worked with them directly. They do not work exclusively with people of color. They've done expungement affairs with me in the district. If you read their website, it actually reads, is a not-for-profit law firm providing free-range civil legal services to people living with low income, older adults, and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault in our communities. I just wanted, for the record, Lakeshore Legal Aid is for everyone. They do some really great work.
Okay, that's fine, but the program description is that Lakeshore Legal Aid offers legal services for low-income families of color and will use their $1.57 million grant to expand their capacity, and it continues on. So that's just what we have at michigan.gov for what they're doing with that program description. Are there any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today. Appreciate you coming in. And there being no further business before the committee will stand adjourned.